Go. Okay. So, welcome everyone. What a great turnout. My name is Liza Lorenzetti, and I'm a social work student here, PhD student, also doing some teaching, and I've been involved in human rights and social justice work for the past 20-something years. I started out as an anti-apartheid activist in Montreal, and been involved in work around what's called the Oka crisis, but really was a huge infringement on human rights, and also been involved in lots of other work, and still developing my own authentic humanity, trying to be a more caring, empathetic, compassionate person. So I'm on that journey, and it's nice to be with all of you here today. I think that we have a pretty good turnout, and I want to commend everyone who went out last night and banged some pots and pans. Who was there last night? Woo! All right, way to go. Excellent. Good, and I think Calgary's just had a new infusion of activists and social justice energy, and it's very exciting. And I think that Calgary's long been known as a place where people don't care, people just care about their SUVs and bigger decks on their homes. But I think that's changing, and I think that we are proving to the world that we're a different kind of place, and a more welcoming, loving place for everybody. So, so thanks for being here today. I'm just going to be introducing people who are going to speak on our panel today, but prior to that, I would like to pass the pretend speaking mic over to Dr. Jackie Siebert, who is the Dean of the Faculty of Social Work, and he would like to welcome you and share a few words.
I would like to thank everybody for being here today. When Lisa proposed having a conversation today, I was actually away at a conference this last week, and I replied pretty quickly, I hope, with an email that said that if there's any place in our society where we should be able to have these honest conversations, it should be at universities. And so I was completely supportive of the meeting today, and I hope that it does go well. I also wanted to say to all of you that at the meeting that I was at over the last few days, there was a motion passed that relates to the conversation today. And the meeting that I was at, and Hugh, just down the table here, was at the same conference as well. It was a meeting of the Canadian Association of Social Work Education, and that is a body that accredits social work programs, including ours, across the country. It's a body that promotes social work education, and a body that meets once a year at an annual general meeting. And this week, on Monday, the student caucus of that organization had a full-day meeting, and they came to our AGM the next morning on Tuesday with a motion that asked for support from all of the delegates there from social work schools across the country, a motion in support of the rights and freedoms of the protesters who are protesting in Quebec. They brought forward a motion that was, I thought, very thoughtfully worded. It was a motion that asked for support for the rights and freedoms of all of those protesting. And so I wanted to be here today to let you know that it was passed unanimously by CDLC. And that's a body that very rarely passes any motion unanimously. It's hard to get social workers to agree on many things, but this is one that people were very strongly supportive of. And it's also a motion that I thought the students did a phenomenal job on. So I'm hoping to set the tone for the conversation with that today. I'm going to apologize because I can't stay for the full conversation. I'm going to stay for maybe another 10 minutes, but I've got a whole stack of things that I came back to today that need to be dealt with. So I hope you have a great conversation, and the faculty will remain supportive of this work in general. So,
would you like a red square?
I would love a red square.
And as a social worker, I have to say it's really happy that because of the activist work of several of you around here, we're getting to be known for something other than things that people don't like. And so I really appreciate all the work, and social workers should be at the front of activist movements, or at least supporting them. So thank you, Jackie, that's great. Maybe before I introduce our speakers, we might have a quick round of just everyone sharing their name or any affiliation they might want to share. Just a quick one, and then we'll get into some of the panel and open it up to, I think, a rich discussion. So maybe we'll start. Do you want to start?
Sure. My name is Seaman. I'm the program manager
Consortium for Peace Studies right here.
My name is Michael. I'm just an undergrad at MRU studying English and philosophy.
You are not just an undergrad.
Okay.
I
am an undergrad.
I'm Stasha.
I'm Barbara.
I'm with the faculty.
And I'm Lord Jake, the faculty.
I'm Jen Lennon. I am just a student.
Hey.
That's it.
I'm Sue Jones.
I know.
I'm Sue Jones. I'm a BSW student doing Parliament Practicum with Lisa.
Viviana Reinberg.
Maddie.
Dave, I think political science here.
I'm Chelsea. I'm a human being. Good one.
My name is Aaron. I'm also a human being, and I do that I identify as an anarchist.
This is Samantha, and I'm Michelle.
Hi, Michael.
Michael.
Great, and hi, we're just doing introductions. Welcome. So I'd like to introduce some of our speakers today. First, I'd like to introduce Brian, who's on my far left. And Brian Seaman has been a research associate with the Alberta Civil Liberties Research Centre since November 2004. He has 2 major works in progress for the centre. One addresses the limits of multicultural accommodation in a liberal democracy, and one addresses increasing surveillance of our private lives and dwellings by agencies of the state, often rationalized as necessary intrusions in the interest of fighting crime or preventing acts of terrorism. So Brian's really well situated to be here today. Let me just see here. In addition to the writing for the ACLRC, Brian, that's the
Alberta Civil Liberties Research Centre.
Thank you. I always get the name mixed up. Brian's articles and commentaries have appeared in dozens. Brian's articles and commentaries have appeared in dozens of print and online media sources in Canada, South America, Europe, including Law Now, Abaledo, Pero Family Rights, Journal, Migration Letters, Calgary Herald, and Ablog. You also write in Spanish, Brian?
No, I had a student who speaks fluent Spanish, and so she translated an article.
Oh, that's
for me.
great.
Yeah.
Excellent.
And we published under a co-published arrangement.
Perfect. So welcome, Brian. And then we also have another sort of social work comrade here, Ed Lee. He's presently a doctoral candidate at the School of Social Work at McGill. He's also involved in migrant justice and LGBTQ newcomer community organizing. And yes, and as a graduate student, Ed has been involved with the student movement in Montreal, especially with respect to building a more anti-racist and anti-oppressive analysis with student organizing, which I think is great. Ed is also, we have to take some credit, also was a social work student here. Yeah. And so there you go. See, Calgary. All great things come from Calgary. Don't say things like that. It still counts for us, Ed. It's really important. We have three other people that have offered to share some commentary, and I'd just like to introduce them. And I know that Jen Len's not feeling too well today, but she has a letter that she'd like to read from a student. Jennifer Leonard's also a social work student, a social worker. She's been an activist. She and her girls often are out at rallies with me and my girl, and they become friends. And I think that similar to lots of mothers, one of our biggest sort of activist work is how we bring up our children and giving them love, care, compassion, safety, and also social responsibility. So there you go. And so I'd like to introduce 2 other parents who are and Michael, you should be a social worker.
Freelance.
Michael and Michael Gretton, sitting there on your far left, have been involved in activist work for years. Human rights work. Michael has, I think, traveled the world. Michael and has traveled the world with the UN, doing work on the ground, and here has started, was the initiator of the African Community Association in Calgary, the Ethnocultural Council of Calgary, and various other organizations, and is a steadfast sort of supporter of human rights, social justice, also teaches at the faculty. And Michael Gretton, similarly, has been involved with one of the initiators of Global Fest, is involved with the United Nations Action Committee of Calgary, bad name, so similar to that, and has been involved in numerous healthcare, anti-racist work, social justice work, and on his day job, he is the coordinator of the Southern Alberta Heritage Language School. So welcome everyone, and I think at this point I will turn things over to Ed, who's going to give, I think, a brief rundown of what's been happening on the ground in Montreal and some of his analysis.
Okay. So I'm not like incredibly prepared, but I'll do my best to kind of give a bit of a context before talking about some of the stuff that's been happening more recently. And so, yeah, I don't know how much people have been aware. I think what I've noticed, and I don't know about here in Calgary, but is that there's been a particular framing of what the issues have been within mainstream media that has been, there's been a lot of distortion that's happened, and I've seen it happen in Quebec, in particular in comparing the French versus the English media, and there have been differences. So the French media has been much more, there's been a more diversity of opinion within the mainstream sort of sources, whereas the Anglo media in Montreal have been very one-sided for the most part, except for open letters that might be published at different periods of time. And so in Calgary, I don't know how has it been for you all here in terms of hearing about what it's been like in Quebec or in Montreal.
What's going on there?
Yeah, what's going on there?
Yeah, what's going on there?
I think it's hard to
Yeah.
As someone who completely rejects mainstream media,
Yeah.
I've been getting lots of great updates via Facebook and via YouTube and via streams like that.
Yeah.
If it wasn't for that, when I do pick up the Sun or the Herald occasionally and I read their dribble, it's very upsetting. We're talking, especially in Calgary, Alberta, we are strong about our civil liberties.
Yeah.
And yet here's a great example where your civil liberties are being trampled upon, and rather than focusing on that, we're going to focus on spoiled rich kids.
Right.
And I think that's a real travesty for what Albertans stand for.
Right. Yeah, so I think that's an important thing to keep in mind. I think Michael is going to speak more about that too in terms of what's happening here and the kind of media that's being presented. And I think that's important before I even talk. Because I'm going to take like 15 minutes, not a lot of time, and I won't be able to cover everything, right? And I, just to say too that I'm just speaking for myself and as a student and as a social worker, community organizer, and so there's a diversity of opinion as well, right? In terms of the students who are involved or students who are not involved, and so just keep that in mind too. And so when I speak, it's not that I'm coming from this place of extreme authority. I'm just coming from a particular viewpoint with specific set of experiences, yeah? Okay. Yes. And as I talk, if people have any questions or clarification, let me know, because I might brush over certain ideas that people might not be aware of. And so, so I think one key thing one sort of important aspect at the very sort of core of what this issue is, so this idea of having a student strike, I think is one that is really important. Like we could talk for an hour and a half on the issue of what is a student strike, what does it mean, especially within the Quebec context, because there's this huge history, right? Historical context of student mobilizing in Quebec from the 60s, and so there's a lot there that I won't go into, but I think it's important to acknowledge that in understanding sort of the way that the student strike is understood in Quebec, is really specific, and in terms of the actual strike itself. So the idea that student associations have the right to mobilize, form a general assembly, and then vote, to strike or not to strike. I think that idea is sort of placed in tension or in conflict with this idea that individual students should have the right to attend classes, right, if they want. And so that's been sort of the key sort of tension, I think, that has operated in a lot of the cegeps and universities, right, that have had general assemblies. And every university will have a different sort of response. So, for example, UQAM, which is University of Quebec à Montréal, is a francophone public university, and for the most part, there hasn't been, I mean, almost every association has voted. Every association has voted to strike, with very little kind of dissent. There's been some, but not a lot. And then you have other universities like University de Montréal and Concordia that where probably there's more students who have been in favor of the strike versus against, but it's you know, it's definitely been a really diverse sort of diversity of opinion in terms of students. And then McGill, which is where I'm at, which I would say the majority of students are against the strike, but we have had general assemblies, and I think actually social work, the undergrad students, we have to give props to them because they're one of the few sort of undergrads that actually went on a strike and in a really big way, and so their general assemblies produced like between 70 to 100, over 100 students oftentimes, so just a huge amount of the student body, proportion of the student body, the undergrads, and they, for 6 weeks, they continually voted in favor of the strike, and so I think, and there's a lot of dialogue within those general assemblies as well, so I think that's something that is quite amazing, because there was this idea, this idea that McGill couldn't strike, or it couldn't happen there, and it did, and so I think that's really, it's been really great to see that. And so yeah, I think that that tension is really important to think about, like, so the rights of student associations to go on strike versus individual students' right to go to class. Yeah.
Sorry, just what makes McGill different that people thought the strike just wouldn't happen there?
That's a really,
Is that a big question?
that's a big question, yeah.
It's, you know, having gone to McGill.
Yeah.
You know, there's a real sense of elitism at the university. I think, having been there myself, I think I was one of the very few people I ever knew who had a real job, like working for school. I think there's a lot of privilege. I don't want to paint everyone with the same brush, but absolutely it's seen as a privileged university. It's also seen as an Anglophone university, and I think that that's part of the issue around Concordia. I think just general stereotypes is seen more as a working university, people's university, of people who have jobs and sort of are trying to get by. And I don't know if anyone would like to counter me on that if they've gone to McGill or Concordia, but there's sort of the common knowledge that there's a real difference in privilege.
Yeah,
so
and I've gone to both universities.
What would you say, Jen?
Yeah, I would agree with that wholeheartedly. Yeah. There is this sort of, Concordia kind of grew on a business class, like in terms of working class, night classes.
Yes, yeah.
McGill, forget it.
Yeah.
You either commit for a full-time study or you don't deserve to be a student.
Yes,
I think that if that captures it, I'm not sure, but it's one element for sure. But divides then further the language issue. Like it's not francophone, anglophone, it's now divided even further.
And I was going to say too, and Ed, what do you think? But I think also we have a lot of international students and who are paying like 10 times the amount of those who are here. So I just wonder about, you know, giving that up and going out on strike and having to explain that to families back home. I can imagine it can be quite difficult to do that.
I mean, I would say even like more than international students would be out-of-province students, right? So McGill, I think, has probably the most out-of-province students. And so there's a lot of students, a lot of out-of-province students have been in support of the strike too. Even at McGill, there's been a lot of mobilizing. But I think that there's also a huge amount of ignorance or lack of knowledge around the historical context of student organizing and student strikes in Quebec, and so people who are from out of province oftentimes don't really know, right? And there's also a lot who are from the US as well, who are international students, and so I think that also has an influence, although there are some US students who have been in support of the strike too.
And I think if you don't have that historical heritage, you don't have a responsibility to it necessarily.
Yeah.
You're there to study, whereas if you're a Quebecer and you're not in, you know, with the movement, I mean, this is the 9th strike from 1968, so this is a real heritage, a rite of passage almost, you see something.
And I think it's been harder to engage in that dialogue with out-of-province students to talk about, because out-of-province students pay more, right, than Quebec students, and so I think that also is like, so how does this impact you, right, as an out-of-province student? I think having that kind of conversation has been important too, and I think it has happened. And you know, the Faculty of Arts had a general assembly, a huge general assembly, and there was like 600 in favor and 500 in 500 in support of the strike, 600 against the strike, and so there was actually a lot of people who were in favor of the strike too, right? And so it was actually closer than what I even thought it was going to be, and so yeah, so I do think that people are aware. It's just that, but there is a large number that weren't aware too, and so that dialogue, you know, was important and maybe didn't happen enough as well. In terms of people understanding and also looking beyond tuition hikes, because the tuition increase is also attached with the university funding plan, right? And I was going to forward you the PowerPoint. The geography grads at Concordia did an amazing job of doing this PowerPoint presentation about it, and basically they're talking about sort of the requirement that the Quebec government is going to have on research being linked to non-government sort of funding, so basically corporate funding, right? And how research dollars, the only way to get research dollars, a certain amount, will be through, if you also have private funding as well. And so there's this sort of neoliberalization, right, of the universities that is already there, but is continuing further with this funding plan. And I think that has also been sort of a challenge too, is communicating what the issues are beyond the tuition hikes. Because that's one thing that's very direct and concrete that everybody can see and understand. But the university funding plan is also this other thing that's really, really important that everybody should understand it and know more about. And actually for me, like when I read the university funding plan, it further justifies sort of the reason for something like a student strike, because I think the way to understand or justify, from my opinion, a student strike is to understand the university as sort of an enterprise or an industry, right? And as students, not just as learners, but as producers, right? As people who produce knowledge, produce things, and so academic writing could be understood as labor as well. And also, I mean, in social work and other places, there's also internships and other things that happen where there's this really close relationship, right, between the university and broader society. So the university is not just a space for learning, even though it is that, but it's also this larger thing around it being this enterprise and this industry. And so I think the funding plan actually kind of just reinforces that idea. And so it further justifies the reason for why the students you know, should have the right to go on strike, and the conflicts that come with that. So that, you know, and there have been conflicts. Like when the social work students went on strike, you know, they're picketing in front of classrooms and stuff, and it evoked a lot of conflict and emotions, and you know, there was a lot of conflict. And for myself, I was a graduate student who was in favor of the student strike, but also a sessional instructor as well, and so it was a bit challenging for me too, to be able to find a way to kind of hear everybody's perspective, but also like know where I was coming from too, and just be transparent about that with people as well. And so, yeah.
So part of that, I know, would be accessibility of education, right?
Yeah.
So whether we argue that was a right or not, and you pay for it.
Yeah.
So have the Quebec government, has he countered that with saying, oh, we've you know, upped the bursaries and the loan, and it's all good?
Yes.
And that obviously is not appeasing anybody because of this larger agenda that you're suggesting.
Yeah.
Is that what you're seeing on,
yeah,
kind of on the ground?
Absolutely, absolutely. So the government has done that, right?
Right, they counter by saying, what's your problem?
Up until yesterday, they refused to budge on the tuition increases. They're like, we're not going to budge on that. We're not going to negotiate around that. That's going to stay the same. And they moved it from 5 years to 7 years. And when you do that, like the numbers actually, the amount that students had to pay actually increases, even though per year it's smaller. Yeah, I think and then they said that we're going to up the loans and bursaries. Yeah, but I think at one point there was a set of negotiations that happened, and this was in beginning of March. So March, I think it was May 4th and 5th, so it was the 3 student associations. And then some union organizers, so three of the main sort of Montreal unions also participated, and then the government. And it was like this 24-hour sort of marathon, and that included the question of increased bursaries and funding and loans, and it was actually quite problematic. Like there afterwards. You know, students, one of the student students who were kind of connected with it, representing a student association, kind of talked about how there are certain clauses that, because everybody was so tired, that the negotiator actually changed at the very last minute. You would get this if you read the French media, right? But the Anglophone media doesn't talk about this at all. And so there are these last minute changes and then they just pressured the students to sign, and it was just this really kind of shoddy negotiation. And then the students actually brought that agreement to the student associations, and the student associations voted on it. And the two pieces about that were the increased bursaries and loans, and then the from 5 years to 7 years increase, and the students rejected that. Absolutely, yeah, because I think that they could see beyond that for sure. Yeah.
Sorry, that was yesterday, or?
No, so that was May 4th and 5th that happened, and this is where it gets, you know, interesting, is like the government passed the Law 78 on May the 15th, May the 16th, 17th, something around there, right? And so to me that indicates a huge amount of bad faith in terms of the government and the Quebec government and its negotiations, because for sure they were developing that law while those negotiations were in place, right?
Yeah.
You can't come up with that kind of huge, expansive law in like a matter of a week, right? I mean, it takes time to develop, and so to me, like, that just is a further demonstration of bad faith negotiations on the part of the
Yeah, and I
government.
suspect Brian's going to talk about this, but
Yeah.
then it gets down to how you can actually evoke such a law, and it is
Yeah.
under special status and circumstance, one of which is that there is sort of a last measure. Is
Yeah.
that true? So if
Yeah.
they're kind of working behind the scenes and kind of crafting this,
Yeah. Yeah.
right?
Yeah, absolutely, and there are definitely this sort of, like, when I was trying to pull together some of the video clips and media stuff, sort of in the lead up to this law, you know, and I sent it to you, there's a few things where I was like, yeah, there are certain pieces that happen, and the negotiations were a part of it, also the protesting that happened before and then in the lead up around the time of the negotiations as well, I think was really important. It's important to know too that, like, the kinds of sort of police violence that was happening towards the protesters were happening before Law 78 happened, right? And part of the justification for the law was this idea that, oh, the students are violent, right? And so there's this sort of demonizing that happened of all students, that they're all violent, and I think that ended up justifying the law as well. And so I don't know if did I get to people's questions around that? Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So I think I guess I'll just talk about a couple more quick things, because it kind of leads into more description about Bill 78, this law, and what it's about and its implications. And so I guess one thing is to just remember, for those of us who are in organizing and social workers and students as well, is that the changes that happened and the movement that's happened and the way that it's grown as well has grown through struggle. So I think it is a movement that is very much shaped by compassion and caring, and the sense that the students who are striking aren't actually necessarily going to benefit from striking either, right? Because they're going to be graduating by the time the full kind of tuition increase will have come. And so there is this level of compassion that's there, I think, that's pushing the movement, but it's also been a movement of struggle as well. And so, you know, there has been a lot of institutional repression within universities through the use of injunctions and other means, and also this sort of you know, repression from the government through the use of police and limiting of protest and peaceful assembly. And I think that yeah, it's important to know.
So I was just wondering about the kind of role of the faculty, or how the instructors are responding. Is there anything coming from that end?
Yeah. So every university is different, okay? And in terms of social work, I mean, every faculty is going to be different. But so the responses have been varying. So at UQAM and UDM, my understanding is that almost nearly all of the faculty were in support, and like the minute UQAM had a strike, the faculty organized like a panel sit-in, teach-in thing right after and had a conversation about it. The social work associations, faculties are at McGill, UDM, and UQAM, so Concordia doesn't have a social work faculty. And at UDM, I think, also was very supportive as well. For the most part, I'm sure that there are some faculty who disagreed too. McGill was a different story, and so I would say the vast majority were either, some were in favor of the tuition hikes. There are some who are against the tuition hikes, but didn't feel like the student strike was an appropriate method or that it worked in the McGill context. And then there was a kind of like a smaller number that were for in support of the student strike as well. Yeah, so it was definitely varying. And I think that, like, if I'm just to be transparent, I think that was one of the things that was really hard for students actually. The undergrad students at McGill in particular was this sense that they weren't necessarily getting the kind of faculty support that they were expecting or wanting. But I also think that kind of, that sparked a lot of dialogue as well. And so, the students did these amazing things, like both the undergrads and some graduate students around fostering dialogue with faculty members and amongst their peers too. And so the way that they decided to strike also, they thought about it in the context of McGill too. And so, for example, they picketed, but they didn't block the doors. So they allowed students to go in, and I think there are certain decisions that they made, and they all decided to continue on with their stages, for example. So there are decisions that they made based on the context of which they're in. So I think if there are students at UQAM, it would have been a different scenario, and they would have had a different range of options. But I think in the context of McGill, they made some really good strategic choices too, and there was dialogue that happened as well. Yeah.
With respect to the blocking of students going to class, I've run into a lot of people taking issue with that, and I feel that a lot of people don't understand. You talked about how it's a place of production too, and how the term scabs and the labor and working class play into that, and how maybe if people understood more what it actually means to be a scab, that they would understand better.
Yeah, and I think that oh, go ahead.
Yeah. No, and I think on that point, I think it's a valid point, and I wonder, and if you can speak to that one issue, if we have time, is it a strike or is it a boycott?
Yeah.
And I know, when we talk about strike, we throw that word around quite loosely. But I think it's an important distinction because it's entrenched on labor law and strike and scabs. To boycott is not, and to cross is not a scab. So I just wondered if that was an important nuance, or has it been settled, I guess, because it keeps coming up.
Yeah.
People will argue it's not a strike.
Yeah.
You can boycott, you can buy a product, and you can, like a Walmart, we don't have to shop at Walmart, or we can have the product and not use it. We can't, I don't think, can we strike?
But I think this goes back to what you said, that it's not just a place of learning, it's a place of production too.
Yeah.
True.
And, yeah. So I don't know whether you want to transition. Maybe I'll just respond to that really quick, and then we can move on to also the implications of Bill 78, and maybe come back to this conversation too, and also strategize. Right. I think the thing about the issue around strike versus boycott, very clearly, those who were in favor of the student strike called it a strike. Those who were against the student strike called it a boycott. Right. And I think that. It also speaks to the underpinnings of how people understand what students are and what university is. And I think that's where this idea of university as industry and students as laborers has this historical sort of acknowledgement in Quebec that is much more acknowledged, right? And so there's much less sort of argument that students should not be seen as strikers because of this sort of these sort of actions happening for decades, right? And I think that's where, if the student movement is going to sort of move beyond Quebec and engaging with these kinds of actions, so student strikes, you know, outside of Quebec, then this idea of university as a site of labor is really, really important to be able to justify a strike, right? Because then when you can make that shift, you know, then you can start talking about what happens in union organizing and how even within unions, there has been a lot of conflict with people wanting to, you know, cross the picket line versus not, and that kind of thing, right? And then unions have historically, across Canada, explained and justified reasons for why they need to make collective you know, decisions, even if some people within that union don't agree, right, with those decisions. And so I think when you can shift the conversation into that realm, then I think it can help to make it easier to justify as to why student strikes through student associations would be worthwhile and valid as well. Sorry, maybe before we.
You guys are leaving.
Yeah, I have to, I just want to make just one observation, because it's on tuition fees, because I don't have much to say about Bill 78. I mean, as we all know, I mean, the Arab Spring, you know, maybe a lot far from Canada, but there is some kind of connection probably if you look at it from the point of, the whole thing started with one person, I don't know if you know that, in Tunisia, you know, was so frustrated with the system, and he just set himself on fire. And that mobilized millions and millions of people, and we know what happened after that. And I just want us to think the underpinning of that whole thing was this whole, you know, many, many years, these people have been going through all kinds of injustice, okay, unfairness, and all kinds of brutalities, you know, and this is perpetuated by the system, of course. But it goes to say whether this issue in Quebec, whether, you know, the tuition fees is a trigger point, whether this would be leading about a much larger issue, because sometimes you need something to start with. And I'm not sure if it's going to be probably, you know, confined to Quebec in the end, because I mean, in many parts of Africa, most of the systems usually change because of, you know, student protests. That's how it starts, but it goes and goes, and then it becomes completely different. And in this particular situation, I think in Quebec, you know, that may be you know, some way of expressing the unhappiness about the system, but at the same time, there may be a lot of other issues hidden behind there that may probably trigger a lot more bigger issues that would probably galvanize the whole country. I don't know.
No, I think your point is excellent. It actually leads really well into Brian's talk around the law assembly, because I think there was this growing movement, and people were starting to talk about not just the tuition increases, but sort of general neoliberal policies, whether it was from the Quebec government or the federal government. And then this law happened, right? This law was imposed, and it actually triggered this sort of even larger number of people who started to realize and understand, okay, so, you know, this is not just about students and about the increases, but it's also about my own rights, right? Whether I'm a student or not. And so I think that the law actually triggered this larger response and helped propel it even more. Yeah, so I guess would this be the time for Brian?
There's just so much excitement. Brian, do you want to add your comments, and then we can you guys stay an extra few minutes? Lisa? That other meeting's not as important as this.
We're doing about 5 after 1.
Lisa, can I just, I'm just going to, someone may be leaving, so I'll just pass this around. It's just a little sheet on how we get involved. Oh, perfect. From our dear friend, our brother Grant.
Thank you.
Yeah, so I'll just pass it along.
So maybe we'll give the mic to Brian and delve back into the discussion.
Sure. Well, first of all, let me thank Liza and the Faculty of Social Work for organizing this event, and also I'm glad to hear Ed's perspective as somebody who was on the ground and can give us a bird's eye view, so to speak, of what's been taking place in Quebec and Montreal in particular over the past several weeks and months. So I'm going to talk about three main areas. I'm going to be discussing, first of all, the importance of dissent in democratic society, and in Canada in particular, in terms of bringing us to where we are today, a country which has a Charter of Rights and Freedoms, which indeed is a model for the world. Chile, for example, modeled its Charter of Rights following the end of dictatorship there. Their charter is based on our charter. The Charter of the European Union reads virtually word for word as our charter does. And secondly, I'm going to be speaking about Bill 78, Law 78, and talking about the sections which I think are offensive to the charter, and I'll be discussing why I think that the Law 78 would not survive a charter challenge. And third, I'm going to step outside of my area of expertise, if you will, and speculate as to why I think that the government of Quebec brought in Law 78 in the first place. So, why is dissent important to liberal democracy and to Canada in particular? Well, we're sitting here today, a country where everyone is equal before and under the law. We have a Charter of Rights and Freedoms, which guarantees rights and freedoms to everyone, irrespective of gender, racial, ethnic background, sexual orientation. And it's unfortunate that so many people seem to take this for granted, because indeed we did not arrive at this place, and it's far from perfect. Obviously, we still have work to go to achieve equality for all Canadians. But it's what I think is the best in the world, and we're still working towards improving equality for all persons. But we didn't arrive at this state because, you know, things magically were handed down from, you know, God or, you know, the powers that be. Indeed, when you look at the history of this country, as I look around the room, there are most people in this room, when this country was formed in 1867, did not have the right to vote, and indeed 2/3 of the people in this room who are women weren't even regarded as legal persons, so you couldn't vote, you couldn't hold elected office, and in many ways women were considered to be properties of their husbands or fathers. The only people who had the right to vote in 1867 were men, and indeed the majority of men did not even have the right to vote in 1867. If you were non-white, you did not have the right to vote, and indeed if you didn't own real property, you did not have the right to vote. So we have come to this stage because of the willingness of people throughout the history of this country to, in some instances, even risk their lives, and indeed there were people who paid with their lives in getting us to this point, where we have the right to assemble and form unions, laborers have the right to form unions, women have the right to vote, and indeed people have the right to participate fully in the political, economic, and social spheres of this country without being discriminated against because of race, ethnicity, religion, and so on. Secondly, I'll talk now about Law 78 and the problems which I see with this law. I don't think it would survive a charter challenge. There's a lot that's wrong with this bill, but I'll restrict my comments to three areas in particular. Sections 13 and 14, which address the freedom of association, or in this case, the restrictions on the freedom of association of students and the right to peacefully protest at institutions. And secondly, I'm going to talk about Division 3 of the Act, which concern provisions they say to maintain peace, order, and public security. And thirdly, I'm going to talk about a section which presumes that student associations are responsible for damage and assault unless they prove otherwise. Sections 13 and 14 of the Act essentially are denying to students, or indeed to anyone, the right to peacefully assemble and protest, not only within the confines of campus, but it says within 50 meters of the outer limits of such grounds. This is overarching, and it is offensive to the right to peacefully assemble. You know, I discussed these particular sections with colleagues, civil libertarian colleagues, before coming here today, and we automatically identified the offensive provisions within this section. And the question that was begging in my mind and my colleagues' mind was, why was this act even brought in when indeed we have the Criminal Code of Canada? It's against the law to cause a disturbance in public. It's against the law to assault somebody. It's against the law to interfere with somebody else's right to come and go as they please. And we're wondering, you know, why, if the authorities had evidence of, we don't even know whether there were students or not. I mean, there was mass protesters 3 or 4 weeks ago who burst into classes, were roughing people up. Who knows? Some of these people may have been agents provocateurs for all we know. We don't know. But, you know, if we had these acts, I mean, we have a Criminal Code of Canada which can deal with these actions. So why was this act brought into place in the first place? I'm going to get back to some speculation as to why this was brought in a few minutes. Division 3 of this law 78, it requires, under these sections here, requires any group of 10 or more persons. It specifically says that you have to apply to the police for permit to have a demonstration or protest march or whatever. You've got to provide details of the route or whatever. This is obviously contrary to the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, because we do have a right under the Charter's fundamental right under Section 2 to the freedom of peaceful assembly. Now, interesting enough, Alberta, you know, with some justification, but I think we have to say as Albertans that parts of the country don't fully understand what Alberta is all about. I mean, we're portrayed, I think, in Central Canadian media as, you know, being kind of, you know, redneck and not caring about rights, but everybody in this room does care about rights. Curious enough, we don't have in this city, you know, which is supposed to be this, you know, sort of conservative city, we don't have anything, any bylaw which requires people to notify the police in advance of a demonstration. In fact, we had a demonstration here, the Pots and Pans, the casserole demonstration the other night, and there were no arrests made, and it progressed peacefully. We have a right to do that in this country. We have a right to do that in Quebec. But we have this law in Quebec which restricts that right, which I don't think would survive a charter challenge. The third area which I want to address, which I think is terribly offensive to not only charter, but indeed is offensive to the fundamental right under English common law to be presumed innocent till proven guilty. Section 22, which says that a student association or federation of associations, and indeed any student which belongs to these associations, are responsible for any damages caused to a person, to property, etc., unless they can prove that the damage was not their responsibility. Well, we have a right under the law to be presumed innocent until proven guilty. Why? You know, it's not because we want to make the job of the police difficult. It's because of the incredible power of the state. When you're suspected of a crime, you can be picked up, questioned, you can be arrested, charged. We have this incredible power of the state. We value individual liberty highly in this country. Therefore, we have a system which makes the state work to prove that you're guilty of a crime. This would not survive the charter challenge. Any one of these three areas would not survive a charter challenge. Therefore, I'm going to speculate. I mean, if there was ever a charter challenge launched to any section of this act, or indeed to the act itself, you know, who knows how court might decide, but I would be shocked if any court in this country would uphold an act which is so offensive to the charter in so many ways. Finally, I mean, I want to make my comments brief so we can have a good discussion, because obviously there's a lot to be said, and we saw some evidence of that during Ed's talk. He took a lot of questions. Why would the Charter government bring in an act that is so offensive to the Charter, when indeed, from a pragmatic policing perspective, we already have the Criminal Code of Canada with its sections against causing a disturbance, trespassing, damaging property, harassing, or assaulting people. I'm going to throw this out for speculation. You know, you have a government which is struggling in the opinion polls. I mean, I've been following the opinion polls for the past several months, and the opinion polls indicate, you know, project anywhere from a very strong minority PQ government to indeed a majority PQ government as recent as a week ago. The PQ would have won an election, we're told, you know, a week ago. I'm wondering whether the government may have cynically decided to play some politics here and indeed help to engineer a crisis. That's my speculation. I mean, John Charest is a lawyer. You know, many politicians are lawyers. I can't imagine that they haven't heard tell of the Charter of Rights and Freedoms.
I don't know.
You know, so why would they brought in an act which is so offensive to the Charter? I can only speculate that it was brought in for cynical political reasons, to you know, to an attempt to manage or gain some political traction from this crisis by appearing to be tough on, you know, some students. Those are my comments. I wanted to be brief so we could have some discussion, and I'll take any questions if anybody wants to jump in.
Because these guys have to leave.
Sure. Yeah. Thank you for that, Brian. And thank you. That was very, very, very informative and frightening at the same time. I just wanted to talk just very briefly about what we can do, and specifically engaging with mainstream media, because I heard your point, and it's frustrating because we think all the mainstream media, they've been bought and they don't give a damn and all that stuff. But I think it's really important that we don't shut ourselves off. We have to engage. We must engage. We have a responsibility to engage. And I think I've handed out an article. This actually, some of you may be familiar with Chris Katarski. He's actually a graduate from here, Military Strategic Studies. He's a really enlightened writer. He writes regularly for the Herald, and so he was published earlier this week about this very issue. And yeah, make sure you read this article. I love the last paragraph. He says, according to Abacus polling, every group except those 60 and older and Quebecers whose tuition rates remain comparatively low overwhelmingly think that Canadian tuition rates are too high in their province. If this is the case, then why disparage young Quebecers for wanting to keep post-secondary education affordable? Why not disparage the politicians in other provinces who shredded this particular part of Canada's social contract in favor of tax cuts about a generation ago? So what I would just really encourage you to do is, I like what you said. You get a lot of your information from Facebook and Twitter and social media, and then you put stuff out there as well. And we all know that's a very, very effective way of getting out to people. And at the same time, I would also encourage you to write letters to the newspaper, call into the talk shows.